I still remember the weight of the morning air, thick with a mix of dust and sunlight, as I stood on my front porch holding my father's folded American flag. I had pulled it from the last moving box I hadn't opened yet. Running my hand over the creases brought back every memory of him. His voice, his lessons, his belief that a man's home was his ground to stand on. I never imagined that on the very same day I tried to honor him, someone would try to take that ground away from me. I wasn't ready for the sound of heels stabbing across my driveway or the sudden shadow falling over my porch. When I looked up, I saw her for the first time. Karen Whitmore, the HOA president I had heard whispers about but never met. Her lips were pinched tight, and she clutched a thick packet like it was a weapon made just for me. "Mr. Lawson," she said, not even glancing at the flag in my hands, "we need to discuss several violations you've already accumulated." Her tone carried the confidence of someone certain they were about to win. I stared at her, confused, feeling the emotional whiplash of going from quiet reflection on my father to facing this stranger who seemed determined to ruin my morning. She shoved the packet into my chest, and when I hesitated, she pushed harder, forcing me to grab it. Inside were pages of accusations: yard height, mailbox alignment, vehicle appearance, all written with the precision of someone who had been studying me far too closely for far too long. I barely had time to skim the first page before she continued talking. "We have standards in this neighborhood," she said, drawing out the word "we" as though I was not included in it. "And frankly, you don't fit them." At first I laughed under my breath, thinking it was a misunderstanding. A mistake. Maybe paperwork from a different house. I told her I had moved in less than a week ago, and no one had mentioned any issues. But her smile, sharp, rehearsed, cold, told me everything I needed to know. She didn't care about the truth. She cared about control. "I'm sure you're new to HOA communities," she said, as if speaking to a child. "So let me be clear. People like you don't last long here unless they learn to follow the rules exactly as written." She leaned forward then, close enough that I could smell the harsh floral scent of her perfume, something that made the air feel even heavier than before. My irritation turned into genuine unease. There was something off in her eyes, something that suggested this wasn't business to her. It was personal. I tried to respond calmly, telling her I'd review the packet and fix anything necessary, but she cut me off mid-sentence. "It's too late for that. Because of the severity of these violations, I've already started removal proceedings." My heart slammed against my ribs. For a moment, all I could do was stare at her, gripping the folded flag in one hand and the packet in the other. Removal? From my own home? The home I had just begun building a life in? The home my father would have been proud of? But Karen didn't wait for my reaction. She turned, heels striking the concrete again, and walked away like she had just delivered a sentence she knew couldn't be appealed. And as I stood there, paralyzed between anger and disbelief, I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't going away on its own. And that was the moment I understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the beginning of a fight she fully intended to win. When I bought my home, I thought I was buying peace. Turns out, I was buying a battlefield. What brought me to this neighborhood wasn't ambition or luxury. It was the desperate need for a fresh start. After losing my father and going through a difficult year at work, I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere I could breathe again. I had spent years working double shifts, repairing engines in a shop that smelled like oil and metal, putting away every extra dollar until I could finally afford a place of my own. When I found this house, tucked between tall oak trees and lined streets, I saw the exact life I'd been chasing. A life where I could drink coffee on the porch without a boss yelling for me, where the loudest sound would be kids playing or sprinklers turning on at dawn. I didn't come here looking for conflict. I came looking for ordinary peace. The day I moved in, the sun was bright, the grass smelled freshly cut, and a couple of neighbors waved as they drove by. It wasn't a warm welcome, but it was polite enough to make me think I'd chosen right. I walked through the empty rooms imagining furniture, quiet evenings, maybe even a dog one day. Everything felt like a clean slate I desperately needed. But even on that first day, something was slightly off. When I carried the last box in, I noticed a woman walking her dog across the street whispering to another neighbor while staring directly at me. I brushed it off. Small towns and suburban communities are known for being curious about newcomers. I didn't think anything of it. As evening settled, I took a slow walk around the block, just getting familiar with my surroundings. Most houses were identical in style, perfectly trimmed, perfectly aligned, almost too perfect. I figured it was just a strict HOA keeping things tidy. Rules didn't bother me. I'd lived my whole life under structure. I respected order. I respected expectations. What I didn't know then was that the rules here weren't just rules, they were weapons, and they were held tightly by one person. When I first saw the HOA welcome packet on my door, I skimmed it without much concern. Pages of guidelines, fines, architectural controls. It all looked typical. But there was one handwritten note at the top that caught my attention. Please follow standards exactly. The handwriting was sharp, almost aggressive, but I shrugged it off. I had no idea whose handwriting it was. Not yet. My first minor disagreement with the HOA came that same evening. I had parked my truck slightly angled because I was still unloading, and a neighbor across the street, a quiet man named Alan, walked over and politely mentioned that the president pays close attention to parking. He didn't elaborate. He just gave a quick glance toward the end of the street where a tall woman was watching from her porch before he walked away. I would later learn that woman was Karen Whitmore. And even then, even with that warning, I told myself I was overthinking it. Rules are rules, I thought. Nothing personal. But the next morning, when I opened my front door, there it was. A crisp white violation notice taped dead center, with my name spelled perfectly, as if someone had been waiting to write it. And for the first time since moving in, I felt a small sharp crack in the piece I thought I had purchased. At first, I thought the violations were mistakes. Maybe clerical errors, maybe the overzealous nature of a strict HOA. But by the end of the first week, it became painfully clear that every single one of them was aimed at pushing me out. The second notice came 2 days after the first, claiming my mailbox height didn't match the community-approved measurement. I'd never heard of such a thing. I grabbed a tape measure right there in the morning sun, checked it twice, and it was exactly within the standards listed in the packet. Still, the violation stood. Then came another. This time, it accused me of grass discoloration. I stared at my lawn, freshly watered and fully green, trying to understand what was wrong with it. Meanwhile, other yards had patches, weeds, bare spots, none of them receiving notices. I started to feel a knot forming in my stomach. Something wasn't right, but the one that really made me realize this was no coincidence was a notice about my truck. Apparently the angle I parked it at was improper and disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic. I had parked it the exact same way every other homeowner did, but this wasn't about rules. It was about me. When the noise violation arrived, that's when frustration turned into disbelief. According to the complaint, loud music and machinery had been coming from my house late at night. The problem? I was working a double shift that night and wasn't even home. The house was dark, empty, and locked. Whoever filed that complaint didn't care about accuracy. They cared about building a case against me. That's when I started digging deeper into HOA laws. And I learned something important. Homeowners have the right to access HOA governing documents and records through county offices. It was the first real piece of power I felt since the harassment began. I decided to start documenting everything. Dates, times, photos, videos, every notice, every conversation. If Karen was going to wage a quiet war, I wasn't going to fight blind. As the days went on, subtle conversations with other residents painted a clearer picture. A woman walking her dog whispered, "She's done this before." A man loading his truck murmured, "Just keep your head down." People didn't want to be involved, but they knew Karen's reputation. She had a history of pushing out anyone she didn't like or couldn't control. I became certain that from the moment I moved in, she had chosen me as her next target. The final confirmation came one night when I stepped outside to take out the trash. and saw a figure near the edge of my yard. The streetlight caught just enough of her face for me to recognize her. Karen, standing there, camera in hand, snapping pictures of my property, like she was documenting a crime scene. When she noticed me watching, she didn't flinch or apologize. She simply lowered the camera, offered a thin smile, and walked away into the shadows. That was the night fear finally replaced confusion. Whatever game she was playing, she wasn't hiding it anymore. The next morning, a thick envelope waited on my door. Inside was a notice demanding my attendance at a mandatory compliance hearing with the HOA board. And as I held that letter, I realized Karen wasn't just trying to intimidate me. She was preparing to officially put me on trial. I walked into the clubhouse hoping to defend myself. Instead, I walked into Karen's courtroom. The room felt colder than it should have, the air thick with something I couldn't name. Anticipation, maybe, or quiet dread. The long table at the front was lined with 5 HOA board members, all stiff in their chairs, all avoiding my eyes except for one person, Karen Whitmore. She sat in the center like a judge seated on a throne she believed she deserved, her posture rigid, her smile too tight to be friendly. The moment I stepped inside, I knew I was outnumbered. The carpet muffled my footsteps, but the tension was loud enough on its own. A few residents sat in folding chairs behind me, some pretending to scroll their phones, others whispering. None of them seemed eager to be associated with me. I could feel the weight of being labeled already, an outsider, a disruption, someone who didn't fit. "Mr. Lawson," Karen began, her voice carrying the authority she had appointed to herself, "we're here to address your ongoing pattern of non-compliance." She spread out a stack of papers in front of her, tapping them for emphasis. "You've accumulated multiple violations in an unreasonably short amount of time." I placed my folder of evidence on the table. Photos, timestamps, even video from the night she claimed I was making noise when I wasn't home. But the moment I tried to speak, she lifted her hand to silence me, as though she were swatting away a nuisance. "Your time to respond will come," she said sharply. I swallowed the frustration swelling in my chest. I reminded myself of something I had read the night before. In many states, homeowners have the legal right to record HOA meetings as long as one party consents. So I pressed the button on my phone's voice recorder, sliding it into my pocket. I wasn't going to let this meeting disappear into her version of the story. When it was finally my turn to speak, I opened my folder and laid out the photos showing my grass was healthy, my mailbox compliant, my truck parked within guidelines. Karen didn't bother looking at them. One of the board members glanced down but quickly lifted his eyes toward her before nodding in forced agreement with her statements. "Your evidence is incomplete," Karen said, dismissing my documents with a wave. "And frankly, it doesn't reflect the ongoing concerns this community has expressed about your conduct." "Concerns?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "According to who?" She leaned forward. "Multiple neighbors have reported you. They claim you've been disruptive, uncooperative, and intentionally disrespectful of community standards." That was a lie, and we both knew it. But none of the board members challenged her. Not one. Then she slid a typed sheet across the table toward me. "Based on these violations," she announced, "you're being fined accordingly." I scanned the paper. Thousands of dollars. My heart felt like it dropped into my stomach. A couple of residents behind me gasped quietly. Even they hadn't expected fines this severe. "And," Karen added, her tone turning colder, "if fines continue to accumulate and remain unpaid, the HOA reserves the right to pursue further action, including potential foreclosure." I felt my throat tighten. Foreclosure? Over fake violations? Over her personal vendetta? When the meeting ended, chairs scraped the floor as people stood, but not a single neighbor looked at me. They slipped out silently, eyes down, as if my presence alone could ruin them. And as Karen declared me a problem homeowner, I realized I wasn't just fighting her rules. I was fighting her entire kingdom. Overnight, people who once waved at me now crossed the street to avoid me. It was as if attending that hearing had marked me with something contagious, something no one wanted to be near. The morning after the meeting, I stepped outside to grab the mail. and Mrs. Dalton, who previously offered me cookies on my move-in day, turned abruptly and went back inside her house. A jogger who usually nodded at me pretended to tie his shoe until I passed. The quiet friendliness I had once mistaken for community spirit now felt more like a thin mask everyone had been wearing, and Karen had ripped it off. Rumors spread quicker than the wind. I caught bits and pieces while mowing my lawn, someone whispering that I fought with the board, someone else saying I refused to follow simple rules. I heard another neighbor say I had anger issues, though we had never exchanged more than a hello. The stories didn't come from nowhere. Karen was planting them, watering them, and letting them grow into full-blown reputations that she could use against me. She didn't confront me directly. Not after the hearing. She didn't need to. She had shaped the narrative so carefully that by the end of the week, I wasn't just a new guy making honest mistakes. I was a threat to her perfect neighborhood. Someone who needed to be managed. Someone who needed to be removed. Yet every kingdom, no matter how tightly controlled, has a few rebels. Mine showed up in the form of a tall, broad-shouldered man named Mark Jefferson. We had nodded at each other a few times before, but this time, he walked straight across the street and stopped at the curb in front of my driveway. He looked around first, checking if anyone was watching, then approached me. "You holding up?" he asked, voice low, eyes sharp. I didn't know how to answer. I shrugged, exhausted, frustrated, and confused. Mark gave a sympathetic nod. "She's doing to you what she's done to others," he said. "Karen hates anyone she can't control. You walked in confident. That made you a target." I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, but recognition. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fit. He continued, "She's not just running this HOA. She's trying to get herself elected to the regional HOA council. She needs to show she can keep her neighborhood in absolute order. No exceptions. Someone like you make her look weak. So she isolates you, pushes you, fines you, builds a file on you." He shook his head. "She wants you gone so she can show the council she runs a tight ship." Hearing it from someone else made everything click. The escalating harassment, the exaggerated violations, the public humiliation. This wasn't random. It was deliberate, calculated, political. "So what am I supposed to do?" I asked. Mark looked around again, making sure no windows were open. "There's something you should know. A board seat is opening soon. One of the long-time members is stepping down. Karen wants that seat filled by someone she can manipulate. She's already preparing for it." I felt a twist of dread and curiosity at the same time. "And what does that mean for me?" Mark lowered his voice. "It means she can't afford to lose control now. She'll do whatever it takes to secure that seat." Then he looked me dead in the eye and said, "And trust me, she's preparing to secure it at any cost." I didn't want revenge. But the day I opened those financial reports, the truth pushed me toward a fight I couldn't ignore. Mark's warning kept echoing in my mind, replaying every time I passed the HOA bulletin board or saw Karen's SUV cruising slowly through the neighborhood. If she was willing to harass me to secure more power, what else might she be willing to do? I needed answers. Real ones, not rumors whispered over lawns or delivered through half-opened windows. So I decided to start where every paper trail begins: the finances. Under HOA transparency laws, homeowners have the right to request financial statements, vendor contracts, and maintenance breakdowns. It's a rule most residents never use, either because they trust the board or because they simply don't know it exists. But I wasn't most residents anymore. I submitted my written request at the HOA office, expecting resistance, but the clerk, an older man who looked exhausted by years of Karen's rule, handed me the documents without argument, almost like he'd been waiting for someone to finally ask. I took the thick stack of paperwork home and spread it across my dining table. At first glance it looked normal. Columns of numbers, landscaping fees, maintenance logs. But the deeper I dug, the stranger things became. The landscaping charges alone were shocking. Every month, the HOA paid nearly double what similar communities paid. At first, I assumed it might be a high-end service, but the invoices were from a company I had never seen working in the neighborhood. Whitmore Green Services. The name hit me like a punch. Whitmore. Karen's last name. Digging further, I found the business was registered to a man with the same surname, her cousin. And the charges weren't just inflated, they were inconsistent. Some months billed triple the usual amount, others had vague descriptions like emergency beautification or priority improvement, without any attached receipts or proof of work. My hands started to shake as I flipped through page after page. This wasn't negligence. This was intentional. The more I examined, the more the numbers painted a picture of misconduct. Missing receipts, duplicate charges, bills for services that didn't exist, projects that had never been completed. Every discrepancy pointed in one direction. Someone was siphoning money out of the community budget, and Karen was the gatekeeper of it all. That's when I felt a presence behind me. I looked up, and there she was. Karen stood in my doorway, her eyes narrow, her smile tighter than ever. I hadn't even heard her come in. She must have followed me from the office. Going through HOA documents without authorization, she said slowly, is a serious offense. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The threat lived in her tone. I made a written request, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I have every right. She stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against my floor. You're interfering with board operations. That can carry legal consequences. My pulse thumped in my ears. She knew exactly what I had found. Her face told me everything. Fear disguised as anger, desperation hidden behind authority. After a tense moment, she turned sharply and left without another word. But the silence she left behind was louder than anything she could have said. Later that night, as I double-checked the documents, I heard a faint tap at my front door. When I opened it, no one was there. Just an unmarked envelope lying on the welcome mat. Inside was a stack of photocopied papers and a handwritten note that read, "You're not the only one who's seen what she's doing." The night my property was vandalized, I realized Karen wasn't just abusing power. She was trying to scare me into silence. Until then, her attacks had been violations, fines, whispers, and intimidation disguised as procedure. But fear changes the moment someone crosses into your physical space. It becomes personal in a way you can't forget. It started with another stack of violations, this time delivered in a single afternoon. 7 of them. 7 accusations so outlandish I almost laughed. Apparently my porch light was too bright, my grass was aggressively trimmed, and my garage door created a hostile aesthetic. It felt like she was running out of ideas but refusing to slow down. Karen wasn't aiming for accuracy anymore. She was aiming for volume. The more paper she could stack against me, the stronger her case for removal would appear on record. But the violations weren't what shook me, it was what happened that night. I stepped outside to put a box in the trash and froze when I saw the mess on my lawn. My mailbox had been ripped halfway out of the ground, the post splintered and leaning like a broken limb. Someone had dragged long scratches across my truck with something sharp, leaving the metal gouged and exposed. My landscaping lights had been smashed and a crude message had been scrawled in spray paint near my driveway. Leave. The kind of message she wanted me to see. My palms went cold. Anger simmered under my skin, but beneath it was something worse. Violation. Someone had stood on my property with intent, with malice, with enough confidence to leave a message without caring whether they were seen. I called the non-emergency police line. They took a report, but even the officer seemed reluctant to get involved in HOA matters. His tone made it clear I shouldn't expect much. That night, I drove to the nearest hardware store and bought the best set of security cameras I could afford. If someone wanted to intimidate me, fine. But I wasn't going to be blind again. As I installed them along the roof line and above the garage, I noticed the neighborhood watching. Curtains peeled back. Porch lights clicked off. People didn't want to be seen acknowledging what was happening. The tension had become a living thing here. Thick, uneasy, unavoidable. And to anyone watching this right now, let me ask you directly, what would you do in my place? Would you fight back, or would you pack up and walk away? Because that night, with every camera I mounted, I felt myself choosing a side. By the time I finished, the yard was lit with infrared sensors, quietly scanning for movement. I went inside, locked the door, and pulled up the live feed on my phone. For a while, nothing happened. Midnight approached, and the world outside grew quiet. Streetlights buzzing, trees rustling softly. Then something flickered on the screen. A figure stepped into view at the edge of my lawn. Slow, deliberate steps. The feed sharpened, and my heart thudded once, hard. It wasn't a teenager. It wasn't a stranger passing through. It was Karen. She walked onto my property like she owned it, pausing as if inspecting the ground. Her posture casual, like trespassing was part of her nightly routine. She moved with the confidence of someone who never expected to be caught. I leaned closer to the screen, breath held, and then the camera captured her turning toward my house, with a look that told me this was only the beginning. Seeing Karen on that footage flipped a switch inside me. I wasn't running anymore. The fear that had been tightening around my life for weeks loosened the moment I saw her trespassing on my lawn. It wasn't just proof of harassment. It was proof she believed she was untouchable. That night, as I replayed the video over and over, something hardened in me. I'd spent too long surviving her intimidation. Now it was time to confront it. The next morning, I cleared off my dining table and laid out every document I had collected since moving in. Violations, photos, timestamps, receipts, statements, even the anonymous envelope with the extra evidence. Months of being pushed, cornered, and humiliated suddenly transformed into a detailed map of Karen's pattern. Targeted harassment, fabricated complaints, financial misconduct, and now trespassing. It was all there, piece by piece, waiting to be used. But evidence alone wouldn't change anything unless the neighborhood saw it for themselves. That meant doing something I never expected to do, walking door to door and talking to the very people who had been avoiding me. The first few conversations were awkward. Some residents cracked their doors open only a few inches. Others kept glancing around as if Karen might appear out of thin air. But what surprised me wasn't their hesitation. It was what they admitted once they realized I wasn't there to argue or accuse. One woman whispered, "She fined me for having my recycling bin visible for 10 minutes. A father of 3 said, "I tried to run for the board last year. She buried me in fake violations until I dropped out." An elderly man confessed, "I've lived here 20 years. This place used to feel like a community. Now it feels like a dictatorship." Every confession added weight to my resolve. People weren't silent because they agreed with Karen. They were silent because they feared her. And suddenly I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for all of us. I also discovered something important while studying the HOA bylaws. During elections, homeowners must be allowed fair and equal opportunity to campaign without intimidation or retaliation. It was a rule Karen had counted on no one knowing. But I knew it now, and I intended to use it. That's when the idea first formed. Not out of ambition, but out of necessity. If Karen was using her position to control the neighborhood, then the only way to stop her was to take away that position. A board seat was opening soon. Mark was right. And suddenly the best way to expose her wasn't to complain or defend myself. It was to stand against her. I decided right then to run for the open board seat. The first time I announced it to a small group of neighbors, they looked stunned, then relieved, then quietly supportive. Momentum began to shift as word spread. People who had been silent for years finally felt seen. They weren't alone anymore. None of us were. For the first time since moving here, I felt something powerful. A community forming behind me, not because they believed I was perfect, but because they believed Karen had gone too far. But word travels fast in neighborhoods like this. And it traveled straight to her. A week later, as I was putting up my first campaign flyer near the mailbox, Karen marched up to me, her heels striking the pavement like warning shots. She smiled, but her eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. "I've decided to run for the seat as well," she said softly, "and I'm going to crush you publicly." And in that moment, I realized the real fight had only just begun. What should have been a simple election turned into the ugliest neighborhood battle I've ever seen. I'd imagined community meetings, reasonable conversations, maybe a few debates. Instead, Karen turned the election into a public spectacle designed to bury me before my campaign ever took shape. The first blow came when residents began forwarding me copies of the official HOA newsletter, emails that were supposed to be neutral, but suddenly included thinly veiled warnings about a disruptive homeowner spreading misinformation. She never used my name, but everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. Within days, new emails followed. They claimed someone, again, unnamed, had a history of confrontational behavior, dangerous tendencies, and unwillingness to respect community standards. She didn't need proof. She just needed fear. And she had spent years building a reservoir of fear she could draw from any time she wanted. But this time, something was different. People started pushing back, not loudly, but quietly at first. A neighbor replied, all to one of her emails, asking for specifics. Another questioned why the HOA was using official communication to influence an election. The cracks in her authority were beginning to show. While Karen launched smear campaigns, I took the opposite approach. I scheduled small, peaceful meetings in my driveway. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic. I laid out documents, timelines, facts. I spoke calmly, answered questions, and listened more than I talked. I didn't need to attack her. The truth was enough. And the truth resonated because people were exhausted. Exhausted from fines, intimidation, and living in constant fear of the next notice taped to their door. Support began to grow slowly, then steadily. A retired couple offered to hand out flyers. A young mother shared her own experience of being fined for toys left in her front yard for too long. A group of neighbors created an online chat to share concerns safely, away from Karen's reach. It felt like the community was waking up after years of being asleep under her control. Then came the sabotage. One morning, I stepped outside to find every one of my yard signs torn down. Some were snapped clean in half, others spray-painted with words I wouldn't repeat to anyone. My small booth at the community green space, where I had set up brochures about transparency and fair governance, was overturned, papers scattered across the grass. I cleaned it up quietly, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. But the more desperate she became, the more obvious her panic grew. She began showing up uninvited to residents' porches, insisting they support her for the good of the neighborhood. I heard from multiple people that she tried to pressure them into signing statements against me. Some refused, others were too afraid. But each refusal chipped away at her confidence. By the final week of the campaign, the neighborhood felt split down the middle. One side clinging to fear, the other clinging to hope, and Karen could feel it slipping. During the last community forum, her voice cracked as she tried to maintain her composure. She accused me of staging harassment against myself, claimed the financial discrepancies were misunderstandings, and insisted I was unfit to lead. But the room didn't react the way she expected. Instead of nods, she got silence. Instead of fear, she met doubt. The election was set for the next morning. That night, as I locked up my house and turned off the porch light, I noticed something white lying under my welcome mat. A folded piece of paper slid quietly into place. No name, no return address. I picked it up, unfolded it, and felt the blood drain from my face. In thick black ink, the letter read, "Stop now, or tomorrow will be worse." When I walked into the clubhouse that night, I didn't know if I'd be elected or destroyed. The parking lot was already overflowing, headlights cutting through the dark as residents hurried inside. The air felt heavier than usual, like the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath for weeks and was finally ready to exhale. As I stepped through the glass doors, the sound hit me first, low murmurs, tense whispers, shifting chairs. The clubhouse had never been this full. Every seat was taken, with some people lining the walls or standing near the back, arms folded, eyes fixed on the front of the room where the HOA board sat like a panel of judges. Karen occupied the center seat, shoulders high, chin lifted, smile strained. She wore a polished blazer and a pin with the HOA logo, symbols of authority she clung to like armor. Her eyes followed me as I walked in, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink down to just the two of us. She didn't appear confident. She appeared cornered. I took my seat near the front, and before the meeting officially began, the board's secretary leaned over to whisper something to Karen. Whatever it was, it tightened her expression even more. When the clock struck 7, she rapped the gavel sharply, demanding silence. "Tonight," she announced, her voice echoing across the room, "we will address concerns regarding Mr. Lawson's eligibility for this election." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. She hadn't even waited to hide her strategy. "We have received claims that he has violated multiple HOA standards and therefore cannot be considered for a leadership role." My stomach tightened, but I stayed silent. Let her talk. Let her unravel. Karen slid a stack of papers across the table as if they were irrefutable proof. "These violations," she continued, "demonstrate a clear disregard for community values and—" I stood, calm but firm. "Those violations were fabricated," I said, my voice carrying through the microphone. "And I can prove it." She froze. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. I reached into my bag and pulled out the binder I had prepared, the evidence I'd spent weeks gathering. I placed it on the table and opened it. Photos, dates, timestamps, videos, the financial inconsistencies I'd uncovered, copies of emails, harassment records, and then finally the footage of Karen trespassing on my property at midnight. "I have documented every violation issued to me," I said. "And I can show that most of them were written without basis. Many were created within minutes of me completing repairs. And this," I tapped the financial statements, "shows questionable payments to a company tied to one of Karen's relatives. Payments far above industry standard." A wave of whispers filled the room. Karen lunged for the microphone. "This is slander," she snapped. "He's twisting information to confuse—" A woman from the crowd stood up abruptly. "I was fined for leaving kids' chalk drawings on my driveway," she said, voice shaking. "You told me it was visual pollution." Another man rose. "You threatened to tow my truck for parking 3 inches over the line." A third. "You fined me for having a wreath on my door that wasn't seasonally appropriate." People continued to stand, voices rising, confidence building. One after another they spoke of intimidation, unfair fines, late-night inspections, threats disguised as warnings. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was the community's truth finally coming out. Karen's composure shattered. Her face reddened, her voice cracked, her words slurred into frantic accusations. She pointed at me, at the board, at the residents, shouting about ungrateful people, and disorder, and necessary control. Every sentence only exposed what she had tried so hard to hide. The board huddled briefly, whispering urgently. When they returned to their seats, the secretary announced, "We will proceed with the election." Ballots were passed around. Pens scratched paper. The room was silent except for the sound of choices being made. Choices shaped by years of fear and one night of truth. The ballots were collected and carried to the front. Everyone leaned forward. Even the lights felt dimmer, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The secretary unfolded the first slip, then the second, then the next. My heart pounded like a hammer striking metal. Every eye in the room was fixed on that stack of paper. Finally, he cleared his throat, looked out over the room and said the words that changed everything. "The new board member is Mr. Lawson." Winning the board seat wasn't about power. It was about taking back our community. The moment my name was announced, the room erupted. Not with celebration, but with a collective sigh of relief. For the first time since I moved into this neighborhood, people looked at me not as an outsider or a target, but as someone who had stood up when they couldn't. Even then, I didn't feel victorious, I felt responsible. Because now, everything that had been whispered for years was on my shoulders to expose. The board called an emergency session the very next morning. Karen didn't show up. Whether it was humiliation or fear, I didn't know. But her absence said more than any speech she'd ever given. With the support of the board, newly awakened, newly willing, we initiated an immediate financial audit. The documents I'd collected weren't just helpful. They were essential. They formed the backbone of what the investigators needed to begin unraveling the truth. Within days, the findings started surfacing. Unauthorized expenses, repeated payments to Whitmore Green Services, her cousin's company, totaling thousands more than market value. Blank receipts, duplicate invoices, funds marked for emergency improvements that had never occurred. Even routine maintenance costs were inflated beyond reason. And the deeper the auditors dug, the more the numbers revealed a pattern of intentional misuse. It wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. It was manipulation woven into the financial foundation of the HOA. When the audit report was presented to the community at an emergency town meeting, you could feel the atmosphere shift. People weren't surprised. They were validated. They weren't angry at the discovery. They were angry that they had suspected it all along, but had felt powerless to stop it. Karen arrived halfway through that meeting, but she wasn't the confident president who had once ruled the room. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for loyalty that no longer existed. When confronted with the findings, she tried to blame clerical errors, then the board, then even the homeowners. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the room no longer feared her voice. A vote was taken right there. Unanimous. Karen Whitmore was removed from the HOA leadership permanently. She didn't leave quietly. She stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. But no one followed her. No one defended her. And for the first time since moving in, I watched the neighborhood collectively lift its head, as though the weight of her shadow had finally been peeled away. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. People started talking again. On sidewalks, across driveways, while watering lawns or checking mail. The silence that once marked Karen's control evaporated. Neighbors who had stood divided during the campaign now stood together, relieved to finally have a community instead of a kingdom. Even simple conversations felt different, lighter, more honest. Children played outside longer. Homeowners brought up new ideas for improvements, not fears about fines. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been holding itself together with tension, and now it could finally breathe. But I'd be lying if I said the victory didn't sit strangely in my chest. Standing in the middle of all that relief, I felt the emotional weight of the journey pressing down on me. The fines, the vandalism, the intimidation, the isolation. It all led to this moment. And even though justice had been served, the scars of the experience were still fresh inside me. Now, as I stood backstage at the clubhouse, listening to residents gather for the next official meeting, I straightened my notes and took a deep breath. The board was waiting. The community was waiting. They weren't just looking for a leader. They were looking for someone who would never use power the way Karen had. And as I stepped toward the podium to give my first speech as a board member, I knew the next words I spoke would shape the neighborhood's future. Sitting in the seat Karen fought so hard to own, I understood why she feared me. I wasn't afraid of the truth. The chair itself wasn't special. It wasn't carved from polished wood or raised above the others. It was just a basic office chair with worn armrests and a faint squeak when you leaned back. But when I sat in it for the first time as an elected board member, it felt heavier than anything I had carried in months. Not because of the responsibility, but because I knew exactly what had been done from that seat and what would never be done again. The room was calm as I faced the community. Not tense, not fearful, calm. People who once avoided eye contact now met my gaze openly. There was no more whispering in the hallways, no more nervous glances toward the podium. The silence that hung in the space wasn't oppressive, it was hopeful. And that hope was what guided the first words I spoke. I promised transparency. I promised fairness. I promised that no homeowner would ever again walk into a meeting feeling like a criminal for asking simple questions or challenging decisions. And above all, I promised that power would never be used as a weapon in this neighborhood again. You could see shoulders loosening across the room, people nodding not out of obligation, but out of genuine belief that change had finally arrived. One of the most important lessons I learned through this ordeal was something every homeowner should hear. Know your rights. HOA rules can feel intimidating, but homeowners have legal protections, and one of the strongest is the right to document everything. Photos, videos, emails, notices. Keep it all, and never allow yourself to face harassment alone. When the truth is on your side, there is no authority, no matter how loud or controlling, that can erase it. As the weeks passed, the peace I had hoped for when I first bought my home slowly returned. Not instantly and not perfectly, but steadily. The neighborhood no longer felt divided down invisible lines. Instead of tense silence, there were casual conversations drifting across driveways. Instead of fear of fines, there were volunteer groups organizing neighborhood improvements. Children played outside longer, and people stayed on their porches a little later, no longer worrying that the wrong color flower pot or a misplaced trash bin would result in a written reprimand. I found my own sense of calm again, too. Walking through the neighborhood no longer felt like moving through enemy territory. It felt like walking on my own street. Finally, fully mine. And every time someone approached me to say thank you, it reminded me that standing up wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about restoring something bigger: trust, unity, and fairness in a place that had forgotten all three. As I close this chapter of my life, I want to speak directly to you watching. If you've ever dealt with an unfair HOA, a power-hungry official, or someone who used authority to intimidate you, your story matters, and your voice is stronger than you think. So if you found meaning in this journey, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and tell your own HOA stories in the comments. Someone out there might need to hear them just as much as you needed to hear mine. And for the first time since moving here, I finally felt it, the peace I bought this home to find.